Okay.
And why?
Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody to our SBI meeting, fiscal planning for the 2022-2023 budget year and legislative advocacy initiatives. I'd like to welcome John Daly and Alicia, who just escaped. Oh, I think she's there. Alicia Artesa from NISBA. I think you guys have weighed in on us before and helped us out along the way, and we greatly appreciate that. So in fine line, we'll turn the meeting over to you guys to enlighten us.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see everybody again. We have some familiar faces, some new faces, and we're going to give you a quick overview of NISBA's legislative priorities for the upcoming session, as well as our budget priorities for the budget process. And so I'm going to share my screen here. I think I need the host to enable the screen sharing. Let's see here. I might have to, let me see if I can.
I'm not sure what that really is.
Let me see.
Maybe Charlie can help us.
I am. Hang on one second.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Just bear with me for 2 seconds. Try to share now.
There we go.
Perfect.
Beautiful.
All right, can everybody see the PowerPoint here?
Yes. Thank you, Charlie.
And so, let's see here. Just trying to get it to go into presentation mode. 1 second. Just got to move this bar at the top. We're having, sorry for the technical difficulty. Here we go. They moved this all around. Okay, so without further ado, Alicia is going to kick us off.
Thanks, John. So for a preview and an overview of the legislative session, and we're going to start with some notable successes from the state budget from last year. So with the 2 federal stimulus packages, the CRSA Act being $3.85 billion and the ARP Act being $8.2 billion, school districts actually fared a little bit better than expected in last year's budget. The legislature and executive codified a commitment and plan to fully fund foundation aid with a $1.4 billion increase in 21-22. Notably, through recent conversations with staff at both the legislature and the governor's office, the commitment to fully funding foundation aid seems to be a top priority for everyone. So that is always good news for us. In addition, last year's budget rejected the executive proposal to consolidate expense-based aids. Also, transportation aid for standby costs from March 2020 to May 2020 were funded. Although this was not the full coverage that we had advocated for, we were pleased to see at least partial funding. Finally, the budget included a study to adequately map statewide broadband availability. And on September 27th, Governor Hochul announced the launch of the Broadband Mapping Consumer Survey to assist in that study. SED also announced the New York State Digital Equity Portal, which was described as an interactive online data mapping tool for communities across the state seeking data on New Yorkers' ability to access the internet to advance digital equity. And that portal is online right now. Next slide, please, John.
Here you go.
Thank you. So notable successes during the legislative session. So bills that have become law. Chapter 60, this bill amended education law to allow absentee ballots for school district elections during a declared disaster emergency, also known as COVID. Chapter 95, this bill extended certain provisions of the general municipal law related to granting localities greater contract flexibility to authorize shared purchasing until July 2023, known as piggybacking. Chapter 417, This bill was passed during extraordinary session and authorized virtual open meetings until January 15th, 2022, much like the meeting we're having right now. And we have been actively lobbying for extended authorization as that extension is set to expire in about a month. Chapter 406. This bill extended the waiver that allowed school districts and BOCES with 51 to 100 employees to remain in their healthcare consortiums and trusts through December 2025. Chapter 623. This bill expanded the definition of child safety zones by adding criteria that pertains to neighborhoods with high crime rates and/or deteriorating vacant buildings that create safety hazards. So the bill that was related to statewide immunization database, it was delivered last weekend, but it has not been signed yet by the governor. So this bill would provide all school districts the capability to batch download student information from the New York State Immunization Information System. In addition, a local bill on health insurance reserve fund authorization was signed into law, while the other various local building aid forgiveness and transportation aid forgiveness bills were not signed. And with that, I'm going to send it back over to John for some other government updates.
Thank you, Alicia. So that's a very good summary of where we've been over the past year and what the outlook from the prior session was as we head into the new one. Critical to all of this is the political makeup of the legislature. And as you know, it's been a very dynamic political year here in New York. I always feel it's important to sort of understand where we're at in terms of the composition of the two houses of the legislature, in terms of the governor, because it's a good barometer for where budget negotiations will go and where legislation will go during session. So as we all know here, we have a new governor, former town board member, county clerk, congresswoman, and lieutenant governor, Kathy Hochul. Governor Hochul assumed office on August 24th. It's been an interesting year for her, I think, from a political perspective. At one point, she was looking at a potentially contested primary. She still has a contested primary, though I will say she is in a much stronger position to win the Democratic nomination than she would have been 2 weeks ago, since the Attorney General dropped out of the election. New York City Public Advocate Jumaane Williams and Congressman Tom Suozzi, however, are still challenging the governor for the Democratic nomination, and there will be a primary. There's also a Republican primary for governor. The two major candidates in that right now are Congressman Lee Zeldin from Long Island and former Westchester County Executive Rob Astorino. So we'll keep a close eye on the governor's race. Of course, we have a new lieutenant governor, Brian Benjamin, who was a state senator from New York City. And the governor has tasked him with a number of things, including, I know he's been promoting some of the governor's public health measures upstate. And he does have an extensive background in business. So we'll be interested to see what the lieutenant governor does over the next year as well. Currently, the all-important composition of the legislature, the state Senate and the state assembly both have Democratic Party supermajorities, meaning they have a 2/3 majority, so they can override a veto by the governor if they all vote together. In the state Senate, we have 43 Democrats and 20 Republicans. In the state assembly, we have 105 Democrats plus one independent, Fred Thiel from the 1st District on Long Island, who caucuses with the Democrats, 43 Republicans and one vacancy. So there is diversity of opinion within those conferences. They're not quite in lockstep. There's certainly disagreements within those conferences on some policy issues, but it's still important to know which parties have control. Will that change over the coming year? No one knows till after the election, but redistricting is critically important to that. Redistricting is underway. It's done every 10 years following the census. New York State currently has a process in place called the Independent Redistricting Commission. Basically, you have Republican and Democratic members on that commission appointed by the various leaders in the legislature, as well as, so there's a total of 8 of them. There's 2 appointed by the Senate Majority Leader, 2 appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly, 2 appointed by the Senate Minority Leader, 2 appointed by the Assembly Minority Leader, and then those 8 members appoint 2 additional members who can't be a member of the Democratic or Republican Party. Back in September, the Redistricting Commission submitted their first set of 2 draft plans for legislative districts to the legislature. The legislature will have to vote on those when they go back into session. If those plans are rejected, they basically get another stab at it. The independent commission gets another stab at another set of plans. If the legislature rejects those or the governor vetoes those, then the legislature can make amendments to the plan. In short, it all has to be in place by the end of February because members need to know which areas they're running in for their districts, because these will be the lines that will govern in the 2022 election. Will they have a substantial change in terms of the composition of the legislature? That's hard to say. Certainly will have an impact on the House of Representatives at the federal level because New York State is losing a seat. So that could cause some significant shifts in the lines. But in terms of the state legislature, it's sort of hard to say if there would be any major change in composition. My guess is probably not, but we won't know until after Election Day. And then finally, we have the Attorney General's race. Of note, Attorney General Letitia James is running for re-election. That had looked like a contested race until she dropped out of the governor's race, ran for Attorney General again. And on the Republican side, there's a few candidates. Joseph Holland appears to be the major candidate. He was the 2018 Republican nominee for Attorney General and a former HUD commissioner for the state. So getting into the state budget, now that we've looked at the political outlay, as you know, the state budget is the centerpiece of the legislative session. A lot of the work for the year gets done there. All of sessions sort of focuses on this process. And as you know, we had a very difficult budget outlook at the height of the pandemic. If you take a look at the budget projections from November of 2020, there was that constant fear. We heard that, the state would be in a hole, we would need federal aid dollars. And as Alicia stated, we got those federal aid dollars. And in short, tax receipts ended up being better than I think had been projected at the time by quite a bit. As you can see here, not only were we not in a hole, but projections are actually looking pretty good over the next 4 fiscal years. One thing of critical note is there is some talk that there may be a 1-year budget surplus. Obviously,
I got it today.
I'm sorry. Is there a question?
Well, it's like a book.
Hey,
It's
Bob Maxwell, if you could, make sure you turn your mute on, please. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I just didn't know if we had a question I can answer.
I believe I muted him, so hopefully.
So yeah, and there is a lot of information here. It's definitely a busy slide, so we're happy to break anything down in the questions too. But the long and short of it is we may have a 1-year budget. I shouldn't call it a budget surplus. We may have a revenue surplus. The projected revenues from the Office of the State Comptroller for tax receipts, if you mix in the federal funding, looks like from the stimulus packages, looks like it's going to be much more than we thought. Right now, it's projected to be about $7 billion and expected to go up. What's going to happen to that money? Nobody knows until the budget process kicks off in March. But I can tell you we're going to certainly be pushing hard to make sure that a lot of that money goes to education. If you take a look here, we have our school aid projections for the coming year, which we're going to get more into, or the coming few years, which we're going to dig deeper into. But the long and short is, a year ago, we were in a difficult situation, and schools were looking at a potential for a 20% mid-year cut. Thankfully, with the stimulus package, and we did do a lot of federal advocacy on this, that didn't happen, and we ended up with quite a few $1 billion over what we had initially anticipated at the beginning of the prior year. I believe we ended up with something in the neighborhood of, scrolling through my notes here, there's a couple different ways to read it, but we ended up with $4 billion from the CSRSA Act and $8 billion through the ARP Act. So the total, we ended up with like just about $13.5 billion in federal stimulus dollars, and came in about $3 billion over on prior year, from the prior year. So we did pretty well. So what is our priorities going into 2022? We want to ensure the 2-year phase in of the full foundation aid funding. As you remember, in last year's budget, the legislature committed over a 3-year period to fully fund foundation aid to the tune of an additional $1.5 billion. We are certainly very happy about that. We want to hold them to that. We want to make sure that that funding commitment is adhered to. Everything that we are hearing right now is very positive. The legislature and the governor are committed to that. We will continue to hold them to that. NYSBA also strongly believes that all districts currently on hold harmless agreements should receive a due minimum increase in foundation aid. We recognize everybody has increasing costs, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we move on. But we also feel that's not only critically important, it's sort of at the center of our foundation aid advocacy going into this year. We also know that the foundation aid formula needs a number of updates and improvements. It is very outdated, and we want to make sure people are getting what's due to them. This is obviously a longer term advocacy point, but we are doing all we can to see those improvements. And you can see here the things that we'd like to see changed. Conducting new costing out studies, that's sort of the most critical piece. We want to review and adjust the weightings for high need students, improve data collection for measuring student poverty, update the regional cost index, review impact of student-based district wealth factors, and account for the property tax cap and the district's expected local contribution. And also very critically, eliminating the use of set-asides. I think we all feel very strongly about that. And those resources can be used in other, basically, sorry, I just lost my place here on my notes, but basically under the 21-22 state budget, that there was $250 million in foundation aid restricted to be spent only on community school programs, regardless of whether a school district runs or wants to run a community school program. So we support the concept of community schools, but we're firm in our stance that funding for such initiatives should be separate from foundation aid. We can dig more into that later too, if anyone has any questions. But
John, I had a quick question for you. If you could go back one slide just for a second. Several of us would love to have the 3-year foundation aid.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably, if they go ahead with year 2, they're going still by old numbers. Wouldn't we almost like them to get some of these things with the newer numbers before all of a sudden we get to year 3? And let's just assume in a perfect world that they get a whole bunch of good new data to go by, stuff that's even within the decade. You know, those are a lot of big changes to look at all within 1 year.
It is a lot. And we're going to delve into year 2 a little bit in the following 2 slides and the specifics of that. I agree. In terms of making, say it was a substantive change to the formula, that, just to be frank, is a legislative heavy lift, though it's something we want to see done. So there is a year 2 phase in plan. Now, we want to make sure it meets everybody's needs. I guess to kind of do a little spoiler alert on what's ahead. We understand that every district is different, and we understand that some districts are technically fully funded right now. That's why we don't think that's enough. So that's why we support that minimum level of funding for everybody. I don't know if that really answers your question, but in terms of a structural change to the formula, that's just a heavy lift that I don't think we could reasonably see in the next year.
Yeah.
But we are happy to talk about the phase-in plan for year 2.
John,
Okay.
My name's Tom Moats from BVS. I was wondering, because I'm very interested in how this formula gets updated. And it could be a good thing for all of our districts, or it could be, have people started to come up with names for this particular approach, or particular people that are advocating, particular, public officials that are advocating for a kind of formula update? For example, Arwada. Most of our schools have lost. So any formula that unnecessarily depends on our WADA is going to hurt our schools. So I'm just wondering, when we meet with our legislators, is there some sort of name that we can put to a specific approach to the formula update that would be advantageous and fair for schools up in our area?
So with so many moving parts to the formula, I wouldn't know of like a specific term of art. There's certainly not one that we've used. What I would generally say is modernizing the formula is key, because they understand that. They understand that it's sort of archaic for one, and two, if we're looking to fully fund the formula over the next 3 years, where do we go from there? How do we make it more equitable in the long term? That's why I would say focus on just sort of the general tenor of modernization. But then on these various points laid out here, I would bring each of those up and pick out the ones that are sort of most critical for you. Because what it ultimately comes down to is there needs to be a change in state statute, which is going to, take an act of the legislature. And since these are moving parts, since they're all integrated, it's certainly something that would be a big ask. So I'd say focus on the most critical points and talk about how they've affected you. But in terms of the specific, term of art or term, I would say modernization. It sounds kind of general, but unfortunately, that's really the best way to go with it. And like I said, they get that. The members do generally talk to their local governments. They understand the concerns of their local governments, but sometimes it's just a matter of, laying it all out on the table and saying, I know you're trying to help us, but here's what we're actually going through day to day. I think examples of how you've been impacted are more critical than anything else.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you can see the general picture of that foundation aid increase. Obviously 2020-21 was a bit of an odd duck year. So we were grateful for the backfill with the federal dollars, but this is the phase-in plan over the next 3 years. And that year 2 phase-in, which we were just discussing, I think this includes all of you. And I apologize if we accidentally left out any one of your districts, but you can see here the phase-in plan for year 2. That asterisk is there to indicate that this is based on the foundation aid phase-in plan included in last year's state budget. And that is that the year 2 increase in foundation aid will be equal to 50% of a district's remaining phase-in, and any final number would be dependent on the enacted budget. So for districts with $0, in essence, it means you're already fully funded under foundation aid. But I really want to emphasize this is critically important, and I hinted at this earlier. NYSBA is strongly supportive of a due minimum for all districts. By way of example, a minimum 3% increase would only cost the state about an extra $60 million, which in the world of state aid is not a lot of money. When I talked about equitability or equitable treatment for districts, that's what I'm referring to. So if you're quote unquote fully funded, we know that you need more done, and we want to make sure we're doing that. We'll continue to update you on the phase-in as well. I should mention that. Obviously, we're going to see what happens over the next year. This is our flagship issue. This is the thing we know our members care the most about. And so we're going to keep everybody not only in the loop as the budget process goes on, but if you're experiencing any difficulties with the phase-in, please let us know. We'll do anything we can with SED, with the governor's office, with the legislature to help you out. And just taking a look at sort of our general fiscal priorities, we want to make sure that the continued full funding of expense-based aids, which provide school districts with reimbursement of approved expenses, is done. a lot of these funds were already expended, as I'm sure you know, in prior years, covering things like transportation, special education, BOCES, capital improvements, instructional materials. So districts that expended these funds in many years, in many cases, to provide mandated services, unfunded mandates, with the understanding that the state would meet their obligation to reimburse them. So we want to make sure that that's done. There's been a number of proposals in recent years to cap or limit these expense-based aids at arbitrary levels. We don't think that's productive. We want to make sure that nobody's being disproportionately harmed, that whatever's done makes sense. And based on the most recent estimates, reimbursement of these aids would require an annual increase, would require an increase of about $450 million over the next year. We want to fight for that in the budget process. We know that this is something that's near and dear to everybody. Transportation aid is particularly important. I don't think I have to tell you, with the current school bus driver shortage, how critical that is. During the shutdown, I know many districts were impacted very negatively. We know that the long and short of it is, I think you had the most difficult transportation framework you've ever faced, and then to have a shortage on the back end has been really challenging. So we were glad to see that in the 2020 budget, there was the inclusion of transportation costs as an aidable expense, but it left 6 weeks of transportation expenses unaidable, just the way the calendar had lined up. And as school districts manage both short-term and long-term shifts to remote education over the past 2 school years, transportation and costs that were incurred by these districts generally continue to be unaidable. And so as districts continue to respond to the challenges of the pandemic, it should be made clear that these expenses are or should be eligible for transportation aid. We want to make sure that they are made aidable and that districts are getting what they deserve and what they need. I talked a little bit about the school bus driver shortage. We know that this is a complex issue. It's sort of made all the worse by this great resignation talk you're hearing about across the country, and the current actions are completely unsustainable. Obviously, we can't live in a world where we simply don't have bus drivers. So we're calling on the state to help fill these positions and incentivize new drivers. I know a number of creative solutions are being kicked around at the state level. It's something we've had some conversations on, but we intend to make it a centerpiece of the legislative session, especially the budget process. Alicia spoke a little bit about child safety zones, which are basically designated areas within a school district where students live a short distance away. And if they're passing through a dangerous traffic area, they can be bussed in. Those zones were expanded, the definition of those zones, as Alicia mentioned, to include things like areas with dangerous housing conditions. And from a code perspective, we want to make sure that if child safety zones are expanded, that they're funded, that you have the ability to do that transportation. We know that's a critical thing. And we're all for the continued expansion of them to cover other factors. Like I said, we just want to also make sure it's funded, and that's something we'll be pushing. And finally, NYSBA's calling for pre-K transportation expenses to be eligible for transportation aid. And I think that's something that would benefit students across the state, but would benefit our districts as well. Building aid forgiveness and transportation aid forgiveness. This is something we hear a lot about. These right now are done as one-time bills. I know there's a number of districts out there across the state that have had something from 2006, 2007 in process for a long time, had a bill in the legislature for a long time, reintroduced every 2 years. We want to make sure that there's a solution that makes sense. Maybe it's a comprehensive solution. That's ideally what we'd like to see. We've always advocated for the state to forgive significant financial penalties for that handful of districts. But as I said, I think a permanent fix is in order and is something we'll be advocating for. And same on the transportation side, we want to make sure as well that the reporting system is more efficient. And that includes transitioning away from hard copy submissions of errors to an online database, or of aid claims to an online database. prior year aid claims, another thing we hear a lot about. We were pleased that the list of more than $300 million in outstanding approved aid claims was ultimately maintained in the enacted budget for 21-22. But we were disappointed that the nearly $20 million in annual appropriations to pay down those claims was stripped out of the budget agreement. We are calling on the state to restore the annual funding provided to pay against this list. I mean, that represents millions of dollars that are owed to school districts. It is the district's money that they are owed. So we also want to make sure that the state could and should use any of that overpayment money as clawbacks as a funding source to further pay down other prior year aid claims. So that process needs to be made more efficient, and it's something that we also want to see people get the money they're entitled to. So that was a lot to take in. As I said, we're happy to answer questions. I know you don't have all night, so I didn't want to go into the full version, but I hope that answers some of the fiscal overview questions you might have. I am going to turn it over to Alicia, who's going to talk about some of our other fiscal priorities. But as I said, we're happy to answer questions at the end. So Alicia, take it away.
Thanks, John. So for student health, mental health, and nutrition, after more than a year of remote learning, obviously in-person schooling has fully resumed. And for students across the state, that's been a great thing. So school leaders are working hard to address learning loss and are assessing student well-being in the wake of the collective trauma. As a result, schools are prioritizing both academics and socio-emotional health as they navigate this landscape. Even when school facilities are closed, schools do continue to provide student health and mental health services, either virtually or by costly delivery services. Therefore, NYSSBA has called on the state to adequately fund these programs that support students' physical and mental health. These include funding for community schools as a separate aid category and dedicated funding for school-based health and mental health services, including infrastructure. Finally, assistance should be consistently provided to school districts to ensure they can safely keep their doors open to students, and we have been actively advocating for all of that. As for BOCES aid, salary cap, and special services aid, school districts and BOCES-based career and technical education programs have proven highly effective in helping to provide students with the essential skills they require to successfully transition to college and careers. The growth and popularity of such programs reflects this success. However, the state reimbursement formula for their BOCES programs has not changed in nearly 30 years, which is kind of shocking to hear that number. This effectively increases the costs absorbed by districts every single year. We are advocating for the state to increase the aidable cap on BOCES salaries for career and technical education instructors. Such programs grow student interest and provide a path to successful employment for thousands of students. At the same time, a proportionate increase in special services aid should be made for similar CTE programs in the Big Five and other non-component districts. Further, NYSSBA has been lobbying for the state to provide local school districts greater latitude to choose from an array of options, a set of graduation requirements they believe will best demonstrate their students' competencies. Obviously, we always advocate for flexibility for the school districts. Was there a question? I heard something. All right. So lastly, we recognize the value of wider variety. So NYSSBA has been asking the state to continue and grow investments in P-TECH and other early college high school programs, including advanced placement, international baccalaureate, and other initiatives that allow for project-based learning. Over to the digital divide. So virtual learning and hybrid style teaching are here for the foreseeable future, as we all know. School districts may choose to move classes online even after the pandemic is over, and therefore we are continuing to advocate for broadband access to be expanded so that students throughout New York are granted the opportunity to access high-speed internet. The state and federal governments must invest in a multi-billion-dollar increase to support school districts, distance and remote learning programs for students who do not have proper broadband access at home. It is critical for us to really advocate for the funds to cover a wide range of expenses, including Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, connected devices, at-home internet devices for students, and more. And again, flexibility for the use of those funds is necessary. So we are continuously asking for those funds to be completely flexible and up to our discretion. In addition to the physical limits of broadband, many families do face cost barriers to internet access. So we are advocating for funding, such as individual stipends for families, to be made available to low-income households who cannot afford high-speed broadband. And then on to environmental sustainability.
Alicia, could I ask a question? This is
Sure.
Tom Oates again from VVS.
Of
So
course.
what I didn't hear you mention when you talked about the digital divide, and that's
Mhm.
has significant impact up here in upstate, is it's not an economic, it's an access issue.
Right.
So many of our students, broadband doesn't go to their house. So
Exactly, yeah.
do you see, you had mentioned before about the survey, is that what they're waiting for? Data on that survey to be able to address that issue of access?
Yeah, so that is one step for that issue. Because the data that we are currently using is based on the federal government's data, which is completely inaccurate and just honestly not very good at this point. That's why the state is taking it on their own initiative to have the Public Service Commission do their own survey. So basically, they're in the process. I'm assuming it'll take, I think the due date is the end of the spring 2022 for that report. So the PSC will have and is currently going through and looking at all of the areas in New York State and basically filling the holes in from what the FCC is lacking. In addition, broadband internet service providers are also kind of getting away with not reporting full things because of how the FCC does it. So they do it on census blocks, which means, you know, your house on one side of the street can have access and my house down the block does not. So the PSC is also looking into that and trying to fill in the holes. So hopefully by the time that's done, we'll have a better picture.
Okay, but that's not going to be done until the spring, end of spring 2022.
Correct. So the
Okay, thank you.
portal, yeah, the portal that's out there now, it's helpful a little bit in that you can see sort of what's going on, but it's just based on the federal government, so it's not really the greatest data set.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So on to environmental sustainability. This year, we did pass a resolution at our business meeting in support of increasing basically funding for schools to adapt to climate change. With the natural disasters and inclement weather becoming more frequent, schools need to adjust how they operate. We are calling on specifically dedicated funding to assist schools in areas of facilities improvements, transportation, and other sustainability measures. So this includes retrofitting or construction of buildings, energy efficiency, and other facilities maintenance of schools through environmental sustainable practices. And this is also in line with the state's current policies. So it shouldn't be, you know, a crazy ask on our part. One sticking point that we're currently discussing with the legislature is that beyond general building aid, there is no dedicated funding source for these sorts of programs, even though the state wants us to do these kinds of things. So NYSBA supports policies to increase and dedicate funding to initiatives similar to NYSERDA's P through 12 schools initiative. If you haven't heard of that, it's really great. You can apply through NYSERDA and get some sort of grant program to help retrofit, get LED light bulbs, things like that. Energy efficiency projects are pretty big, so that could be helpful. And if you are looking to upgrade, those funds are currently available and we're asking for more. And I think that's to the next slide. I might be back over to you, John.
If I get the slide to move, oh, I got to renew my antivirus protection. My computer wants me to know right now. It's breaking through with that urgent message. So thanks, Alicia. Some of our non-fiscal policy type items we're looking at this legislative session, and a lot of them are ones we have looked at in past legislative sessions, include virtual open meetings. This is something we are hearing a lot about. I'm sure you're hearing a lot about. As you know, during the pandemic, school boards, city councils, county legislatures, they were authorized to meet virtually in order to enable social distancing. We had a lot of people who liked that. We had a lot of people who disliked that. We had people all across the board. But what we do generally hear from our members, and what we did hear through our resolutions process this year, is this is something that members want to be permanent. The ability to meet virtually at local option permanently. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to, but you should have the option, because as unprecedented as the pandemic is, and as much as it made sense during the pandemic, I think we can all agree here in upstate New York, we get a lot of snow, and it would make sense to be able to meet virtually in a snowstorm, to be able to meet virtually if there's a hurricane, because we do get hurricanes here now, which we didn't used to, not that I can recall, but seems to be a yearly thing. The long and short of it is, this is a flexibility that makes sense on a permanent basis. Right now, it's authorized through January 15th, 2022, as Alicia noted. That was done in the extraordinary session. You can continue to meet virtually your school boards until then. At that point, they'll reassess if they want to extend it. We haven't heard anything one way or the other on if it'll be extended. If I was guessing, given the current uptick in cases, given the Omicron variant, and the fact that January 15th is a month out, I wouldn't be surprised if this is extended. That would be my guess, but we haven't heard anything as of yet. As much as we want that authority to be permanent, we know a major concern that members have is their personal privacy. We don't want members having to post where they're Zooming into a meeting from. You shouldn't have to say, I am at my house and I am Zooming in, and here's my address. And by the way, public, you have access to my living room for public comment. That is a nonsensical public policy. That's something that's not good for the democratic process. It makes members not feel safe, and it's not particularly productive for the public either. So we want to make sure that any permanent extension of this that we are advocating for includes common sense reforms to the open meetings law, that our members, school board members, and other members of public bodies, city council members, town board members, don't have to disclose where they're Zooming in from. It's interesting because a question that I could see coming up that we do get a lot is during the pandemic, you haven't had to disclose that information, at least according to the Committee on Open Government. In a normal setting, say somebody was on vacation and they were Zooming into the meeting or calling in, they did have to. But during the pandemic, that was suspended. It's still suspended under this extension, under the interpretation that is the controlling one right now. But it's something that should be in statute. It's something that should be in the law, that you have that protection. So we'll continue to work very hard at virtual open meetings. We've had a lot of good conversations, including with the governor's office on this. I think you're going to see things that you're going to like in the budget, without, saying anything that's hasn't been decided on or has been decided on. Nothing's decided until budget negotiations happen, but these conversations are productive, is what I'll say at this stage of the game.
John, this is Robert Batson. One of the things that's we've kind of thought about, we've talked a little bit locally, is especially in New York here, if you get some snowbirds that actually go down to Florida for 3 months, that almost self-precludes some of our more senior members of the community who have a lot of information, especially older teachers who have retired, who might want to get back into board service. This precludes them from doing that. So if this change can become permanent, it would really help us up north here, especially of possibly getting some older members of the community to help us out on the school boards with a lot of knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's one of many benefits, because sort of the approach that has made sense from our perspective, from say the governor's office's perspective, from the legislature's perspective, is you have people on the other side of this who say, oh, it's going to inhibit the democratic process. How are we going to do public comment? If anything, during the pandemic, it expanded the democratic process. We had more people participating in board meetings, more people participating in local government because of the fact that they could do it virtually. And I think that's true from what you're saying too, from people, serving on a board, assuming of course, you lived in the state, you met the requirements to run, and you were doing everything appropriately. It really would be beneficial to everybody on all ends. And in the 21st century, it just makes sense. It's kind of crazy that people have to brave a blizzard right now if they want to go vote, perform an essential public service. So I'm feeling very, very optimistic that we're going to see something in that direction this session based on what we've talked about so far. IDA and pilot reform, industrial development agencies and payments in lieu of taxes. This is a perennial issue I think we all hear a lot about. Districts have seen more and more of these pilot agreements over the years, and other economic development tax incentives. We have consistently been calling for reforms to the pilot process, to the IDA process, particularly that disclosure requirements be updated so that the school board is informed when these pilots are entered into, or when the IDA promulgates a tax policy. And additionally, we do want to be sure that school board members are guaranteed representation on IDA boards, or they have the authority to try to disallow a tax deal with the IDA from applying to school property taxes. So there's different flexibilities there. There's a number of good pieces of legislation out there of which we're supportive. So the long and short here is we want to see more transparency and want to make sure school boards' voices are heard. Increasing the fund balance limit. This was something that was talked a lot about during the pandemic. Currently, districts can only carry a maximum undesignated fund balance of 4% per year, which I think most people would agree is not enough for many districts. Any amount in excess of that 4% has to be used to offset property taxes or placed in an authorized reserve fund, which is then restricted for use on future expenses. So these current restrictions, as I said, they don't leave a lot of wiggle room, especially in this tough economic environment, especially at a time when, we have things like inflation or, all kinds of economic uncertainty out there. So we feel a higher cap, maybe 6%, maybe 8% in that range, is not only needed, but it's fiscally responsible for districts, and it allows districts to budget. And it's, it's not going too far, but it's giving that flexibility that's needed in these times. And then finally, tax cap reform. The property tax cap, the sunset clause was repealed in 2019. So there's little action that can unfortunately be taken to address the inequities and the unintended consequences that the cap created when it was established a decade ago. That under the current framework, what they did basically wasn't helpful. But we have things we want to do that would be helpful. And the main thing is prohibiting negative tax caps. As you know, right now, the allowable growth factor year over year is the lesser of 2% or CPI. In a year like this, where CPI is high, it's much easier to get to that 2%. But in a lot of other years, it's been less than 2%. That reins districts in a way that's simply not fair. We'd like to see that changed in statute. It should be a 2% minimum for everybody. So even if the CPI comes in one year, it's 1.8%, everybody should get that too. That's only fair. We also think that pilot agreements should be included in the growth factor calculation. So districts aren't seeing an impact from that and aren't losing out, critical revenue because of that they're already losing from the pilot agreement potentially. And reforming the override process. The override process, I think all board members are familiar with how difficult that is to do and the impacts of that. It should certainly be reformed in a way where, the total onus isn't on school districts. Maybe there's other ways to do it, but it's not fair that you should sort of be between a political rock and a hard place, should that ever become necessary. So I just want to show you here a quick chart of the growth factor over the last few years. Sort of gives a perspective on that negative tax cap issue I was talking about. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but you know, all these years that CPI was less than 2%, particularly in, I seeing on my chart correctly behind the screen here, particularly in 2016, 17, that was a very difficult year. So we just want to make sure that this is equitable and that everybody gets at least that 2% minimum. So I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia to talk a little more about the school bus driver shortage from the policy end of the world.
Thank you, John. So as we've discussed and as everyone knows, the school bus driver shortage is a huge problem that every school district is currently facing. I think we get phone calls pretty much every day on this issue. So we have a couple of policy slight fixes. I don't think they'll, solve the puzzle here, but they will definitely help. We've been calling on the state to increase the retiree earnings cap for school bus drivers. So that would, I think it's capped right now at like $30,000 or $35,000, and most bus drivers at this point are making more money than that. And so this cap is really hindering a lot of, people from staying in that job. And another policy change we are looking into and strongly advocating for is to modify the CDL requirements for school bus drivers. So for example, the CDL requirements are basically just a general requirement. They have to take all the same tests as like Mack truck drivers do. We feel that school bus drivers should have a different exam that they go through and different training, and this would definitely help in incentivize new drivers to come on the road. So if anyone has any other suggestions, we're really trying to figure out what we can do here to get bus drivers, because we've seen it across the state. People are having to pay, like students or schools are having to pay parents to drive kids to school. It's just kind of crazy how serious this got. And these simple fixes could help the shortage now and also in the long term. So we're really focused on just anything we can do to help schools at this point.
Alicia, how much of the CDL requirements are federal issues and how much of them are state? I mean, I think it sounded to me at the beginning of this that these requirements had always been required federally, but just kind of lax as it came down through the states, and all of a sudden the feds kind of tightened things back up or tried to force compliance with them.
Right. Yeah. So we've been seeing that. We think that at the state level, we can kind of scale it back. I'm not positive on how the federal government will play a role into this, but we do also have our federal, like this is on our priority sheet, both state and federal. So we have had these discussions at the federal level. So we're trying everything just to make sure we can figure something out, because you're right, like the federal government tightening these regulations is making it really difficult for us on the state level to do much, but we have sent this information to the feds, and we will be going back to Washington to discuss things in January. So hopefully we can bring that up again.
And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but aren't there new requirements that New York State is supposed to be implementing for inspections and all kinds of other things starting in February, or have they scaled that back or held that?
I haven't heard that yet or heard of it.
I thought there were some new regulations coming into effect in February that they were hopeful the state was going to postpone maybe at least until the end of the year till we get to the summer.
Yeah, I can look into that. I'm not positive. I haven't heard anything, like we haven't had it brought up to our attention at this point, but I'm sure you're right that there's some sort of new regulations, because there always are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So, sorry, one second. Next, we have the school budget votes and elections. So we are advocating that the state grant the Commissioner of Education authority to move vote dates due to emergencies. And in addition, we're supportive of allowing absentee ballots for religious observance, again, with the theme of flexibility and allowing us to have some autonomy when it comes to these things. We think it's really important that school districts and the education authorities have that capability, and it's not just left up to the rigid state rules. For schools as polling places, so school boards are publicly elected by their communities, as we all know, to provide governance and oversight. Currently, county boards of elections can require school districts to open their doors for any election, general, primary, or special election. When selected, school districts have no recourse regardless of the impact on school operations. So the board controlling any building other than a school building that has been designated a polling place, like fire stations, municipal buildings, things like that, they have the authority to file a written request for cancellation of such designation. However, schools, for some reason, do not have that capability. NYSBA has been advocating for this for years. We believe it's unacceptable to burden school administrators with additional hurdles, and especially at a time when, you know, it's hard enough having our school doors open with the pandemic and other safety issues. Just seems like they're making it an even bigger challenge for us. So we have been lobbying the state to allow boards of education to determine whether or not the school district buildings should be used as polling places. That is a very controversial issue for some reason, so we're trying our best on that one. For the regional high schools, we think the state should examine expanding the existence of regional high schools. So in this model, students attend elementary and middle schools in their local community and then attend a regional facility for high school. For flexible school days, obviously, flexible scheduling is now a part of everyone's lives, including students. Many current learning platforms include hybrid of in-person and online classes, and we believe that school districts should have greater flexibility in determining their school calendars and organizing their students' instructional days. So under current law, school districts are required to hold at least 180 instructional days or an hourly equivalent between September 1st and Regent Rating Day in late June. If they fail to do so, they are at risk of losing their state aid, which is a pretty hefty fine. So NYSBA has called on the state to provide flexibility to begin the academic year earlier than September 1st, if that's what the district chooses. So as always, on the theme, we want flexibility and authority over our own scheduling. Then I think the next slide, a fun one. COVID issues. So obviously it's sort of the elephant in the room, but we didn't really focus on it too much because we've all been talking about COVID for 2 years. If you have any questions, please ask. The new variant is throwing everyone for a loop, but I think we're all trying to figure out, and it seems like everyone has adapted to living in this world, and we're just hopeful that we can just keep educating the students, and whether that's online, virtual, in school with masks, whatever the rules become, hopefully everyone is safe and healthy. And it seems like our teachers and schools are doing a really good job of making that happen.
Yeah, now I want to jump in with a quick point on that. We've consistently heard, especially when we were under the executive order sort of framework with the prior governor, with the emergency powers. Obviously, that's not what's going on right now, but we've heard pretty consistently that guidance from Department of Health, guidance from SED is confusing. Shocking that that would be the case. We agree. We certainly would agree. It's frequently confusing. So we're happy to help interpret anything that we can, whether it's us or, you know, more particularly through our legal department, anything that we can do to assist or to reach out, always let us know on those COVID issues. It's rapidly changing and we're happy to help. Here's our contact information for the entirety of our team. You know, our Director of Government Relations, Brian Fessler, and Caroline Bobick, our colleague, as well as Danielle Grasso, who is our grassroots advocacy manager and our coordinator for our department. So we're gonna share this PowerPoint. We'll make it available to all of you. I'll get who would be the best point of contact, if you could drop it in the chat for me to send it to. We'll send it along, and we're happy to take any of your questions as well. We know we threw a lot at you, so we got it down to an hour. It was an hour and a half on the webinar, so that was pretty good.
Yeah, I think if you just send it along, I sent a message to Alicia, send it along to Charlie and she'll get it out to everyone else here locally, I think would be a good help. Because a couple of members I know had asked for it, so she'd be the good point of contact.
Absolutely. We'll send it right along to her. Any questions? We're happy to take questions over email or over the phone too. You can always reach out to us anytime.
Any questions, anyone? Nice, nice. Good work.
Feel free to email us, or I'll give you also, I like to do this. Here's my cell phone. If anybody wants to reach out after this tomorrow, whenever, with additional follow-up questions, I'm 518-817-3023. You can always get me on there and I'm happy to follow up with anybody. So thank you so much to everybody. We're very grateful to be here with you. It's always great to see everyone. Thank you for bearing with us for this rather thorough presentation. And if we can help, just let us know. Everybody have a great holiday too.
Yes, and thank you for bearing with us. Usually Jim handles this stuff, and as a rookie stepping in, I see it's not an easy task behind the scenes.
Well, this was enjoyable. It always is. We hope we'll be back next year, and we're sure we'll talk to you before that.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.